We just had the election in 2019, 2 years ago. Would many of the key players be running again? We know that the Conservatives have a new leader now. Andrew Scheer's gone.
Correct.
Aaron O'Toole is the Conservative leader, but many of the other candidates would be, except for Elizabeth May. There's been a shakeup in the Green Party.
Right.
But some familiar faces, though, would be running again?
Yeah, I think most observers are suggesting that you're correct, that most everybody this will be their second time, with the most notable exception of Aaron O'Toole, I suppose, and the Conservatives. Most people looking at the numbers are saying this is going to be a very interesting election, because it's not absolutely crystal clear that should Mr. Trudeau go forward with that they'll win a majority government, in part because his favorability numbers are okay, but not wildly robust, but still quite healthy. Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the New Democratic Party, has really ticked upwards. Aaron O'Toole, as you mentioned, the leader of the Conservative Party, is probably the least favorable national leader, somewhere around 20%. But when you look at how, Canada's got these 338 seats in its House of Commons, and you look at how they're divided by province or territory, and you sort of figure out who's got to win and where. When you go from east to west, in Eastern Canada, the Maritime provinces, Newfoundland, that's a Liberal stronghold. You move to Quebec, and while the Liberals might win some seats in the odd NDP, it's the Bloc Québécois, a decidedly nationalist party, who's going to emerge at the forefront, because Quebec politics right now is in a very nationalist phase. You move to Ontario, and Ontario has always been the most crucial province to win, and for the Liberals to win, they really need to once again outperform in the province of Ontario, and they have to be careful that the NDP, particularly in the Greater Toronto area, doesn't steal too many seats. And then I guess the other outstanding question when you go from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia is, can the NDP manage in certain regions, in, for example, the Greater Winnipeg region, Southern Manitoba, or the Greater Vancouver region, to take away some of those seats that were Liberal. They may have been Green seats, they may have been Liberal seats, but the fact is, if Mr. Singh and the NDP are successful in that remains to be seen, then that could be problematic. I think if anybody is suggesting right now that Mr. Trudeau would win a majority government, it's not going to be an overwhelming majority government. So.
And what are some of the, COVID obviously, but what are some of the other big issues right now?
It's interesting, Tom. In Canada, Canadian politics, there's always, it's a country that in some respects, because it's not a great power like the United States, that issues of foreign relations, for example, tend to be much lower on the priority list, or even issues of national defense. What tends to dominate, and has always dominated Canadian politics, is issues of domestic concern. So in addition to Canada's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the overwhelming issue, and has been, and it is continues to grow, is the question of the Government of Canada's response to the needs and concerns of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities. The First Nations communities in Canada have that particular, the various concerns that First Nations communities hold have been growing and growing in importance in terms of the political discourse in Canada. And it's only been accelerated in some ways by, I suppose, two things, one of which was when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a multi-year commission that took place in Canada, filed its 94 recommendations. Mr. Trudeau was campaigning, came in as Prime Minister with the list of saying, yes, there are 94 recommendations, we're going to move forward on many of these. There's a sense that his government, while progressive in tone, has not been necessarily progressive in terms of actually implementing and taking action on policy, including Indigenous folks and Indigenous issues. And I think that's very clear. But more recently, of course, there's been the horrible discovery of children and adults who were disproportionately children who were attendees at Canadian residential schools, going back to the 1880s, that were buried in mass graves on a number of locations, and they're just starting the work to locate these now.
Sadly, hundreds of
victims. Yes, most notably of recent origin in British Columbia and Saskatchewan. But these residential schools that were a sort of a combination, I guess a collective effort of the Government of Canada on the one hand, and churches, principally the Catholic, but not exclusively the Catholic Church. It's a horrible thing to think about, because, you know, if your son or daughter had been taken from your community, First Nations community, and essentially brought to a school to say, listen, your traditions, your values, your language, your heritage doesn't matter, and that we're going to strip that from you, and we're going to instill a good sort of English, white, settler type of perspective on you. And in many cases, a lot of these families weren't told whether it was disease or whatever the cause may have been as to why their child died, and how they were, very crudely, buried. So there's a lot there, and that's going to continue. So in many respects, those two issues, but particularly the Indigenous issue, has been growing in importance over the last 20 years, and it's clearly the dominant issue in Canadian politics now.
And does
really
that potentially hurt Trudeau with the discovery and what's been unfolding for the past several months now? Is there a growing distrust of the government that goes with that?
That's an excellent question. I think to the extent that Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal Party are vulnerable on that, they're vulnerable in the sense that they, as I say, in 2014, 15, and beyond, have come out in a very positive, proactive, progressive voice. But when you actually measure the actions that they've taken, they've been very limited. And they haven't address the needs and concerns brought to their attention by the media, by the Indigenous communities across Canada. So I think he is. On the other hand, if you look at the other parties involved on that issue, I think the New Democratic Party might be viewed by prospective Canadian voters as willing to go out there and do more. The Conservatives really aren't viewed, at least, as sympathetic towards these issues. So I think while it could hurt him, it provides him with an opportunity. And it's an opportunity to go to Canadian voters and say, listen, we need to do a whole heck of a lot more than we have been doing. And what does that mean? And then sort of, defining what those are and providing some clear timelines, some clear benchmarks about when things will take place. That would be very important, I think,